Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this week's Ukraine update from Compass Media, the only Irish source of honest news about the NATO Ukraine Russia war. I'm your host, Finbar Markey. On this week's edition, we'll be updating you on changes on the battle lines. We'll also be asking, has Ukraine's Nazi mask slipped as Canada's Parliament cheers on a former Ukrainian Nazi SS soldier? Are Ukraine's backers finally backing off as more countries give less? We'll also be asking, is the Irish government's support of Ukraine in contravention of the Republic's constitution? We'll be looking at much more too. So let's get started. Looking at the battle lines first, again, as with our last report, there's very little change. Ukraine continues to throw infantry into the front lines, only to be destroyed by artillery shells. The map on screen now shows the area of battle lines called Robotyno and Verbova, and it's here that Ukraine has concentrated most of its attacks over the last number of months, what it's called the counteroffensive. The area ringed green is Robotyna and Verbova is ringed in blue. They are two small settlements that the Ukrainians have been trying to take since the beginning of their failed counteroffensive. They have succeeded in capturing most of the village of Robotyna, which is now just a pile of rubble, and they continue to try to unsuccessfully take Verbova. Scores of thousands have died on the Ukrainian side to take these two small settlements. Robotyna only had a population of about 450 people before the war. This second map is of the area from afar and shows just how unsuccessful Ukraine's summer counteroffensive has been. The area circled green is Robotyna Verbova, and the Ukrainian plan was to descend southwards, capturing masses of land as they moved towards Crimea to the very south of the map. This next map shows the changes of the battle lines since the beginning of January 2023. The blue area refers to lands captured by Ukraine's military, and the red refers to Russia's gains since January. How many scores of thousands have died for this? Moving on to news beyond the battle lines, and the masks slipped in the Canadian Parliament this week when the Speaker of the House introduced and honoured a former Ukrainian Nazi Waffen-SS Galicia soldier, with the entire Parliament giving the former Nazi SS paratrooper volunteer not one but two standing ovations. House Speaker Anthony Rota, who has since resigned over the affair, introduced former Waffen-SS Nazi soldier Yaroslav Hunka into the Parliament, honouring him as a war hero. Hunka was seated next to Ukrainian President Zelensky, who was on tour of the US and Canada seeking more funding and weapons. There was global outrage at the reports of the honouring of a former member of the notoriously cruel SS division, and this was broadcast around the world. In response, Canada's beleaguered Prime Minister Trudeau, in a statement, distanced himself from the incident, blaming it entirely on the House Speaker and Russian disinformation. We'll watch this quick video of Trudeau's statement, and we'll be back in a wee minute.
Obviously, it's extremely upsetting that this happened. The speaker has acknowledged his mistake and has apologized. But this is something that is deeply embarrassing to the Parliament of Canada and, by extension, to all Canadians. I think particularly of Jewish MPs and all members of the Jewish community across the country who are commemorating Yom Kippur today. I think it's going to be really important that all of us push back against Russian propaganda, Russian disinformation, and continue our steadfast and unequivocal support for Ukraine, as we did last week with announcing further measures to stand with Ukraine in Russia's illegal war against it.
Canada's Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland is the granddaughter of another Ukrainian Nazi official who fled to Canada after World War II. Freeland and her family have been involved in whitewashing the horrific activities of former Nazis now living in Canada. After the incident this week in the Canadian Parliament, Freeland was asked if a commission investigation into former Nazis living in Canada should be reopened. Here's what she said.
There are calls by B'nai B'rith to reopen a report by the Deschênes Commission so that Canadians can know how many veterans who fought with the Nazis are here in our country. Will the government do so, and what is your response to that?
I think, let me just start by reiterating, and I don't think it can be said too many times, how hurtful for so many people in Canada and around the world what happened was and has been and continues to be. As MPs, in our capacity as MPs, it's important for appropriate next steps in the House to be taken, and I think that is our immediate focus. And as a government, we're going to be very thoughtful about any further steps that need to be taken.
Although proto-Nazi political parties did not do well in Ukraine's elections, they have established militant groups and have embedded themselves in authoritative positions in Ukraine's military and police, with far-right battalions such as the Azov Battalion and the Adair Battalion becoming Ukraine's territorial or national guard. The Nazi Waffen-SS continues to be celebrated in Ukraine with regular marches and memorials. Only days after the outrage over Canada's ovation of a former Nazi, Hunka, Ukraine's President Zelensky was filmed signing a Waffen-SS Galicia flag. It is notable that as Ukraine's benefactors express remorse for cheering on a Nazi volunteer from a brutal Nazi SS division, they continue to ignore the realities of Nazi influence in Ukraine itself. Ukraine's English-speaking trans representative Sarah Ashton-Krillo, yes, you heard that right, who was fired only 2 weeks ago for making public threats to kill pro-Russian journalists, has been duped by Russian bloggers into making admissions regarding Nazis in Ukraine's military. In a separate clip, Krillo is heard using language to describe Russians that is straight out of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. We'll have a listen to both and we'll be back in a wee minute.
I think we have a terrible problem with most foreign fighters here because they are just a step above mercenaries, and they come here because all they know is warfare. And while I defend them in public, in private, I know many of them have very far right leanings, so there's some not to bring new people in.
And so what do you feel about Russians orcs now? So I think that it is part of Mongoloidans.
Sir, you have a European party, and the reality is Russians are not European. Russians, as Mr. Danilov was clear to say, Russians have a different culture. Russians are Asian. And ultimately, they do come from the Mongols. They do come from a grouping, Mr. President, Mr. Deputy, of people who are wanting to be slaves and want to be led just as it was from the days of Genghis Khan. And so I wish the rest of Europe and the Western world understood that Europe ends at Ukraine. We are protecting European values. And
in related news, and support for Ukraine's military campaign appears to be dwindling fast, with key allies such as Poland, Slovakia, the UK, and even the US unable to maintain support. The British newspaper The Telegraph has carried a headline indicating that the UK has no more weapons to give to Ukraine and that UK defence is now in a precarious position because of the weapons already provided. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that Ukraine has only a few months' weapons and ammunition left, and this is probably a generous estimation. The numbers of recent casualties on the Ukrainian side and artillery assaults by Ukraine are reducing notably, and this indicates that they're reaching the bottom of the barrel in terms of their manpower and their available materiel. The Polish government has also stated that it will no longer provide weapons to Ukraine. Poland has been one of Ukraine's staunchest allies, and this announcement comes as a severe blow. In fact, Poland's President Duda has in a video interview described Ukraine as a drowning person and suggested Poland would be pulled down if it continues to support Ukraine as it has done in the past. Slovakia's elections this week brought another blow to Ukraine as the winner, Robert Fico, ran on a platform of ending support for Ukraine. Slovakia was one of the first countries to commit military aid to Ukraine in the form of fighter jets. Despite faltering support and disaster on the battlefields, Britain's Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has audaciously written a piece for the Telegraph newspaper stating that Ukraine is actually winning the war. The delusions in the article are astounding, especially as it's published the same week that Wallace has called for Ukraine to conscript younger men. The EU Commission's unelected president, Ursula von der Leyen, has made a public commitment to provide 1 million artillery shells to Ukraine. This is despite the fact that the EU does not have such production capacity. Von der Leyen is infamous for her patently false claims about the Ukraine war, such as her claims in spring 2022 that the Russian army had run out of basic equipment and were forced to steal electrical parts from household refrigerators. Meanwhile, the Irish Deputy Prime Minister or Taoiseach, Mihon Martin, on a visit to Kiev last weekend, described his government's unilateral decision to arm and train Ukrainian soldiers as humanitarian. This is despite the fact that thousands of videos have emerged of men being forcibly conscripted against their will off the streets of Ukraine. Apparently, forced conscription is also humanitarian. Martin's comments and his government's provision of lethal aid and training to Ukraine may yet ignite controversy in Ireland, as the Irish Constitution prohibits the nation's participation in wars without a vote by the Parliament. This has not happened. Ireland also has a triple lock mechanism to protect her neutrality. Poll after poll has shown that Irish people wish Ireland to remain neutral as a republic. Staying with Irish matters for another minute, and Irish MEP Mick Wallace has delivered scathing commentary in the European Parliament about those profiting from the war in Ukraine. We'll have a listen to this and we'll be back in a wee minute.
You said that multilateralism and dialogue has been weakened. Goddamn right they have. We've refused to engage in dialogue and diplomacy on Ukraine. I'm not excusing the Russians. Putin was completely wrong to invade the place. But we could have tried to stop it, however. We've actually, in April 2022, we stopped peace breaking out. There's too many people, too many elites wanting the war to continue, and you're part of it. Your industry doesn't want the war to stop because you make less money. The Americans and NATO don't want the war to stop. This is a mad show. And there's, as my colleague said, we have a housing crisis in most countries in Europe. People are waiting too long to get a medical appointment. Healthcare is unaffordable for so many people. Social services are getting weaker, and we can't spend enough money on military, and we don't give a damn about the hundreds of thousands dying in Ukraine. How do you sleep at night?
In our second last story of this week's programme, and NATO's head Jens Stoltenberg has confirmed what he and most Western governments have been denying since the start of the war, that Russia's military operation in Ukraine was the result of NATO expansionism. We'll watch the quick video and come back.
NATO allies have really now demonstrated that they are delivering on the commitment we made in 2014. Because the war didn't start in February last year, it started in 2014. The full-fledged invasion happened last year, but the war, the illegal annexation of Crimea, Russia went into East Donbass in 2014. Since then, NATO has implemented the biggest adaptation of this alliance in modern history, in decades.
And finally, US Republican Rand Paul has made a blistering speech against further US support for Ukraine. Let's have a listen to this.
Some say the war in Ukraine is a fight to save democracy. But those who say that need to be honest with themselves. Ukraine is far from a shining example of democracy. And while the strain of war can make for questionable government actions, we have to live with them when the war is over. For all the platitudes about America supporting democracy and making the world safe for democracy, the Woodrow Wilson advocates among us, the biggest recipient of American welfare, Ukraine, canceled its next presidential election. You're telling me we're sending $100 billion to a country that's not going to have elections? We're going to send $100 billion to a country that now has, what, a president for life? I say, oh, well, we could, but it's difficult. Does anybody remember the American Civil War, where 600,000 people died, and yet we didn't miss an election? They've canceled the presidential election. We should cancel our aid as a response.
That's all for this week, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Please like, share where you can. Be safe, and we'll see you next week.